Thank you for joining us again on another one of our a Safer at Home series. Very nice to have you join us tonight. Before we get started, a couple of things. Just let you know that this is like all of our talks that have been on these virtual forums. This is sponsored by Cape Cod 5, First Citizens Federal Credit Union, and Martha's Vineyard Savings. And all the books that we have as part of our series, including this one, is available at 8 Cousins Bookseller in Falmouth. We hope you you join us for that and participate in shopping there. As you know, when we do these things, if you've got a question, we'll do them at the end. Use the chat feature down at the bottom. Please mute yourself. And also want to make sure that I wish everyone a very happy Veterans Day, and I hope that you, if you've got a veteran in your family, that you've taken the time to thank them for their services. We wouldn't be here doing what we're doing without them. Our speaker tonight, Dr. Serena Zabin, is a professor of Early America and director of the programs of American Studies at Carleton College in Northfield, Minnesota. So through the magic of Zoom, she can be there and join on Cape. But this is not her first foray into New England, because she went to Bowdoin. So she's been to these climes before. And one of the reasons I wanted to have her do this on Veterans Day is this book that she's written about the Boston Massacre actually talks about the families and the soldiers, and essentially a lesson that we sometimes forget, that soldiers are people too. So would you welcome Dr. Serena Zabin?
Thank you so much for inviting me. Thanks to all of you for coming on Veterans Day. I am honored to speak today for exactly those reasons. I wrote this book because I really got to know all of these soldiers that we hardly ever think of as real people, and it feels like an important day to honor them. I also know that every day of 2020 seems nuttier than the one before it. And it's hard to remember sometimes that there is a world and a history that's untouched by this pandemic and by electoral politics and all of the changes we're living through. So let's take a minute to remember that there is still another world, one that is beyond our screens. And so we can immerse ourselves in the past. Tonight, I'm going to talk a little to you. I'm going to read a little bit to you. I hope by the end of the hour, you'll come to understand why I call the Boston Massacre a family history. But more than that, I hope that this is an hour in which you can just enjoy a story or two. I expect that you're all here because you like stories. That's why most of us get into history, and you like storytelling. So for any story, we need a setting. So we're going to start here with Boston, March 1770. So it's just 250 years and 6 months or so, not quite ago. And those of you who are on the Cape, I think, can imagine what it's like to live so close to the Atlantic. Any of you who are joining from, say, the Great Midwest, as I am, maybe need to take a little more of your imagination for that. But Boston, it might be helpful to remember, in 1770 was just about a square mile, a peninsula that stuck right into the Atlantic. Only about 16,000 people. So really kind of a small town, even smaller than the one I live in right now. So we start with the setting, think about where we are, think about when we are, and we start with a very basic story, okay? And the most basic story of the Boston Massacre is probably the one that most of you remember, which is essentially a moment when British soldiers shot protesting Bostonians in the street, okay? So here I'm just going to give you all a little something to look at. So most Bostonians really have some, most Americans have some vague idea of this event, largely because of this one picture, which is Paul Revere's famous engraving of the Boston Massacre. Here, what we see are hapless Bostonians mowed down by a phalanx of disciplined soldiers who are being urged on by their captain there in the back. There's a lot of gore, of course, and there's that one woman with her hands to her breast right in the center. And her presence, if you take a good look, is a little hint to the viewer that she's surrounded by a group of respectable Bostonians, not by a mob of hooligans. And then, of course, there's the dog, that symbol of loyalty, who's here looking very lost. This picture is clearly meant to be propaganda, right? You probably all remember this, but if you take a good look, you can see the Customs House was renamed Butcher's Hall. It's obvious that this is an image that's meant to blame the army for this bloodshed. And if somehow the viewer misses it in the picture, you could always check out the poem at the bottom, which is not easy to read in all of its florid glory, but it puts all the blame on the army captain and what the poem refers to as his savage bands, who are grinning as they look at the death caused by their bloody hands. And, the rhyme between savage bands and bloody hands gives you some sense of the quality of this poetry. It's not a subtle take. Okay, so the obvious bias against the army that's in this engraving is easy for all of us to dismiss, right? Because it's so obvious. But that particular bit of anti-imperial propaganda has distracted viewers for centuries from a different untruth that's hidden in this picture. And there's a very different part of Revere's story here that we need to unlearn. It's so obvious that I think we don't even see it anymore. And this is what I might call the story of the two sides. So let's take another good look at this picture, because the very center of the image is this thick white line of gun smoke. Visually, this line separates the row of disciplined red-coated soldiers from the crowd of terrified civilians they were slaughtering. The smoke marks the split between inhabitants on the one side and soldiers on the other. And this picture of two opposing sides, American and British, has always seemed so obvious that no historian ever thought to question this part of Revere's story. But the truth of the matter is that civilians and soldiers were not on opposite sides of the street at all in 1770, neither actually or figuratively. So once we stop letting Revere tell us what we can see, once we start seeing all of Boston, not just this little bit, right, this block that Revere shows us, there's actually a whole different story of Boston and of the coming of the American Revolution that's just lying there in plain sight. So to get to this different story, I want to back up both to the beginning of my book and really to quite a different beginning. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen here, and I'm just going to read to you a little bit from the beginning of my book, which starts not March 1770, but indeed starts June 7th, 1765. A young Irish woman made her way through the crowded streets of Cork to the harbor. Following the red coat of her husband to the dock, Jane Chambers approached a man in uniform and gave him her name. To her relief, he let her pass. The name of her husband, Matthew, had also been checked off the list, but the uniformed man did not bother to note the name of the couple's child. At last, after weeks of waiting, Matthew and Jane Chambers, along with their child, boarded the HMS Thunderer, where they joined Matthew's mates in the British Army's 29th Regiment of Foot. 3 days later, they set sail for America. It may seem strange to begin an account of the Boston Massacre with a woman in Ireland, yet she and women like her are the threads that tie together the range of people and the complexity of the forces that led to that dramatic moment. The complete story of the death of Bostonians at the hands of British troops is more than the political upheaval that followed the shooting. It is also the story of personal connections between men and women, civilians and soldiers. Over time, the women and children associated with the 18th century British Army, skip the page, have been forgotten. In the American imagination, most of the men too have been reduced to anonymous troops rather than considered as individuals. Jane Chambers was not and is not famous. Her early life is lost to historians. We know neither when she was born nor in what year she married. Could she read or write? Was Matthew Chambers her first love? Had she ever dreamed of a life beyond Ireland? The sources are silent on these questions. But other parts of her life, including the choices she made, the family she created, and the voyages she took, have left traces. The everyday life of an ordinary woman would become part of an extraordinary moment. So when Jane and Matthew Chambers are boarding that troop ship, they're part of a peacetime deployment. And I'm going to assume here that you won't object to a brief review of the history of the 1760s. So 2 years earlier, Britain had won the 7 Years' War. And in North America, that war had been fought primarily against the French and their native allies. As a result of the British winning, the French withdrew all of their claims to Eastern North America, including most of the area we now know as Canada. Their native allies, unsurprisingly, did not cede their land. So now the British Crown had to figure out how to manage their new empire and how to pay for that war. And among the many policies that the British Parliament pursued after 1763 were several schemes to centralize the administration of their new empire and to raise some money, particularly on imported goods. And these were tactics that were unpopular, to put it mildly. So in Boston, there were riots against both the customs duties and those who were supposed to collect them. In 1768, after a particularly enormous protest, the Massachusetts governor decided he needed some backup. He decided then, for this backup, he wanted some troops to help keep order in Boston. Now, there's three things that one needs to know about the 18th century British Army. First, the whole idea that there should even be an army in peacetime, what was then known as a standing army, seemed wrong to most Britons. The general idea was that a government really shouldn't have an army that it could turn on its citizens. In fact, Britain did have a peacetime force, although everyone was very clear that it was subject to civilian authority. And this brings me to my second point. Governors and magistrates often ask the War Office to send them troops to use as a police force because there's no formal police actually in the 18th century, not in England. And it was as true in England as it was in the colonies. All over England, smugglers tried to evade import taxes and local magistrates tried to catch them at it. And in fact, that same year that the Massachusetts governor asked for troops, so 1768, the man who's in charge of distributing regiments around the British Empire complained that so many magistrates had asked for troops either to support customs officials or to suppress riots all over England that he was running out of regiments to hand out. So no one was singling out Boston for particularly rebellious behavior in 1768. And so now here's the third thing that you need to know about the 18th century British Army. We often think of 18th century armies as parallel to contemporary ones in everything except their equipment. However, just to remind you where we are here, they were significantly different because 18th century armies traveled with women and children, as you can see from this 18th century watercolor. Hundreds of military families, therefore, flooded into Boston in 1768, and their presence in the town had an enormous impact on future events. So when the governor of Massachusetts said he needed troops to help support the work he was doing for the British government, the War Office said, sure. The War Office was used to using troops for precisely these reasons. But when those first two regiments of the four that would eventually come sailed into Boston Harbor here in the fall of 1768, the governor and his council were still squabbling about where the troops should be quartered. And so for this fight to make sense, I'm just going to remind you a little bit about what Boston looked like. All right, so here we see Boston in 1769. Okay, this is what the map looks like. This is what it looks like stretched over a modern map. And you might notice how much of the 18th century harbor here has been filled in. And this matters actually because of the fight about where those soldiers were going to find their quarters. The selectmen thought that soldiers should go in these refurbished barracks that are out in Castle Island. And here's a look. If you were standing on Castle Island, you can see Boston way out here in the distance, all right? And it really seems pretty far away. On the other hand, the governor and the commanding officer wanted them right in the heart of Boston. And this is the problem. The 18th century Quartering Act was very clear that soldiers had to be housed first in existing barracks. If there were no barracks, then regiments went to public houses, which we now know as pubs. You can imagine why maybe commanding officers weren't that thrilled to put soldiers in pubs. But only then, if there were no barracks and no public houses, only then could soldiers be put into private homes. And Boston had barracks right there in Boston Harbor on Castle Island. And in fact, you can, oops, I'm so sorry. See the castle again. Oh, we are only going forward. My apologies. Let me get us backwards. I hope. Here we are. So you can see where the flag is. You can see that there actually are barracks there. They're very nice. Massachusetts had just refurbished them for the use of British troops during the 7 Years' War. But the problem was that those barracks were a good 4 miles away from the center of Boston. You can see that from this map and with the line that I drew on it. And this put the governor and the commanding officers in a quandary. Okay, they wanted to use private property to put the troops in right in the center of Boston where that little box is. But the selectmen warned them that they actually, the town officers, would get those officials and soldiers cashiered for violating the Quartering Act if they tried to take private property. So in the end, they come up with a compromise. The Army would not requisition private property. Instead, they would pay for it. So this is what it ends up looking like. First, the Army rented all of the available warehouses in the center of Boston. And those warehouses here are pretty much the blue boxes that you can see. But that simply wasn't enough room for what ends up being about 2,000 soldiers and their families. So the Army ended up having to hire private houses, rooms in private houses, even outbuildings to house all that overflow. And as a result, the troops and the townspeople found themselves living literally together. This decision ends up turning Bostonians into landlords. So the larger map of Boston that you can see here shows the homes of some of the soldiers. But what it really demonstrates to us is how completely soldiers' families moved into the streets of Boston. Far from being isolated in that small circle near the town center, soldiers and their families also lived in the rooms and yards of Bostonians in every area of the town. So when 2,000 members of the Army moved into a city that was only 16,000 residents in total, they sometimes found each other a little annoying. Right? It's a lot of people. And men like Paul Revere, who were part of the Sons of Liberty or other political groups, definitely saw the presence of troops as a military occupation. The clerk of the town meeting complained that Boston is become what he called a garrison town. He and the other men walking through Boston at night were really annoyed that they got stopped in the street by soldiers who were patrolling it. And meanwhile, the constables who made up the Boston Watch found themselves the brunt of some pretty abusive language from drunken officers. But their complaints are not the only way to think about troops in Boston. Instead, I'd like to suggest that we think of a very different place when we think about the term garrison town. So take a moment to call to mind Meryton in Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice. Think of the excitement that having a regiment quartered a few miles away created for that family at Longbourn. Fathers might be anxious, but young women were delighted. So think of Lydia Bennet imagining herself at a regimental encampment like this one. As Austen says, I just have to quote this because it's so fabulous, she saw all the glories of the camp, its tents stretched forth in beauteous uniformity of lines, crowded with the young and the gay and dazzling with scarlet. And to complete the view, she saw herself seated beneath a tent, tenderly flirting with at least 6 officers at once. The soldiers that beguile the young women of Meryton during the Napoleonic Wars were not so different from those red-coated men who caught the eye of Boston's young women in the years before the American Revolution. The arrival of regiments in Boston in 1768 was just as exciting to those local women. Pride and Prejudice, I think, can help us understand what it meant to families and neighborhoods when a regiment was quartered nearby. The arrival of nearly 2,000 men, many of them young and single, all of them with a steady, if small income, could not help but attract the attention of young women. With so many young men frequenting taverns, strolling the streets, dropping by a neighbor's kitchen, an unmarried woman might well be able to find a husband, possibly one even living in her family's spare room. I mean, who knew that doing laundry could be so fun? Oops, love this one. Like Lydia's father, however, Mr. Bennet, some men found it impossible to control their female dependents in the face of so many redcoats. So now let me read to you one of my favorite stories, because I think it will give you a little flavor of what it was like to live in Boston in those years. So this one is from middle of the book. Hold on. And it's entitled, Love Your Neighbor. While his comrades in the 29th Regiment were camping on Boston Common or meeting their new neighbors, Private William Clark was spending his time with literature, his own. 2 months after his arrival in Boston, Clark announced that his play, The Miser, or The Soldier's Humor, a comedy of 3 acts, was available for purchase by subscription. The broadside announcing the subscription included a brief and nearly correct Latin phrase, non possunt placitur omnibus, can't please everyone. Presumably, Clark acquired enough subscriptions to publish his play, since the following February, the printer Ezekiel Russell advertised in all the Boston papers that he had just published The Miser and would sell it with a blue paper cover for 8 pence. Sadly, no copies remain for us to read today. Russell may not have printed many, and the short run was likely read until it fell apart and then, like many cheaply printed pamphlets, reused as toilet paper. Such a fate might have been particularly appealing to some Bostonians. In the winter of 1769, not many residents were likely eager to read about the soldier's humor. Private William Clark seemed to have a flair for drama off the page as well. In May 1769, he had a shouting match with the Boston Watch. When stopped on the street, he threatened to burn down the town workhouse and all of Boston with it. As the watchman arrested him and brought him to the local lockup, Clark swore he'd have his revenge on the entire town. It took Clark only a month to stage an even more melodramatic scene with the Boston locals. One June day in 1769, 75-year-old Joseph Lazenby was shocked upon entering his married daughter's house to find Clark in bed with his 20-year-old granddaughter, Mary Nowell. The elderly son of Liberty ordered Clark out of the house, but the insouciant soldier declined to leave. He had every right to sleep with Mary, Clark asserted. After all, she was his wife, he told the astonished old man, and he was going nowhere without her. Clark may have been stretching the truth a bit. Mary said that they had been married one evening by a person who was dressed as a priest. In fact, they were not married until 4 months after being caught in flagrante. But married they were, much to the distress of Mary's parents. So devastated were they, the Boston Evening Post claimed, that the news of the affair much impaired their health. 2 weeks after the marriage, Mary's father had a showdown with his new son-in-law. Clark shoved a loaded pistol into Joseph Nowell's chest. Joseph pressed charges, and after many adjournments, in April 1770, Clark found himself in jail until he could pay a 40-shilling fine. William Clark's marriage meant more than family scandal. It became political fodder for Boston's Sons of Liberty. In fact, the story of Joseph Lazenby finding Clark in his granddaughter's bed was reported in newspapers sympathetic to the Liberty Party. Nodding to a sense of propriety, especially about sexual matters, the press usually replaced many personal names in its stories with dashes. But Bostonians obviously knew something of the Clark story before it was printed. When the shopkeeper, Harbottle Dorr, read the account in the Boston Evening Post, he carefully annotated the article, recording that the young woman in question was Mary Nowell and her grandfather, Mr. Lazenby. Boston's newspapers rarely printed accounts of sexual scandal for their salacious details alone. Those kind of earthy stories were much more likely to show up in fiction or in rhyme doggerel. The Journal of the Times used the story to point out the political implications of this illicit marriage, urging its readers to reflect on the inevitable impact of troops on Boston's families. They said that the most dear and tender connections must be broken and violated by the presence of those troops. The ultimate blame for the seduction, the article concluded, must fall on those imperial officials who have been the authors, they said, of those scenes of public and private distress. The old man stumbling in on his favorite granddaughter was only the preface to the primary protest, the quartering of a standing army in times of peace. The author argued that in the world of occupied Boston, public and private affairs of the heart were one and the same. Now, it seems unlikely that Clark thought of his seduction in terms of politics. He spent his time in prison imagining his next literary work. In August 1770, he took out another advertisement, this one for his new memoir, a true and faithful narrative of the love intrigues of the author William Clark, soldier in His Majesty's 29th Regiment of Foot. And this is actually only the beginning of his extensive title. Clark's love intrigues exposed an 18th century soap opera, complete with cameo appearances by various Sons of Liberty and British Army officers in settings ranging from prisons to bedrooms. He clearly meant his 60-page narrative to be a tell-all, and perhaps also a means of revenge, targeting his in-laws, because unlike the Journal and other newspapers, Clark named names. The long title of his memoir concludes with these words, in which is given a faithful account of his courtship, marriage, and bedding with Mary Nowell, daughter of Joseph Nowell, boat builder at North End, Boston, a description of how much he suffered on said account. The memoir has not survived, So we can only imagine how Clark might have told his version of being found in bed by his lover's grandfather. We can assume from the title and from its emphasis on Clark's suffering that his journal would depart from the narrative in the Sons of Liberty's journal. The villain of Clark's tale is his father-in-law, called out by name. This flippant young man was not troubled by the politics of the British Empire and its impact on his wife's family or hometown. Instead, his was the age-old story of young lovers and disapproving parents. Now, Clark's story of how he created a family out of his relationship with local Bostonians is perhaps the most dramatic of all the ones I found, but there were many, many other ones. In fact, many families created both real relationships, that is to say, they had children together, they married each other, but they also created fictive relationships in Boston. So when soldiers and their wives had children, they often baptized them in local churches and asked local Bostonians to act as godparents for them. So, so soldiers and their families became a part of Boston, and they also became part of families and communities outside of Boston as well. So it's just one example. Let me just talk about one surprising piece that brought together locals and soldiers, which was desertion. As I worked on this book, one thing I found particularly surprising were the rates at which men, and here almost entirely single men, deserted from the army. They deserted at something more than 3 times the rate that men usually deserted from the British Army in the 18th century. During the 7 Years' War, for example, the British Army in North America lost about 3% of its force every year to desertion. In the first year and a half that the 29th Regiment was in Boston, they lost a full 10% of their men. These men were not just fleeing the unpleasantness of Army life, nor were they just drawn to the beauty of Massachusetts. And I'm sorry I'm not there on the Cape, but indeed, Massachusetts is a beautiful place. But soldiers left and stayed gone from the Army because they made new homes. And when the Army tried to come and take back deserters, their new communities often turned out to protect them. The commanding officers were obviously deeply frustrated by this rate of desertion. So at one point, the colonel decides he's going to hire a spy to ride around the countryside and look for deserters. The spy is quite successful at finding deserters. He's not very good at getting them to come back, in part because they put down roots. So it's just one story. Just over the New Hampshire border, the informer found a deserter, or the spy found a deserter whom he calls a likely man, which is another way of saying a good-looking guy, who, having lived near Portsmouth all winter, he was now married to Sarah Foster, who's his landlord's daughter, and he was starting a family. He was easily recognizable, the informer continued, because he frequently wears his regimental jacket. He continued to wear his jacket, but he never returned to the Army. He had a son and stayed in New Hampshire. So what we find is that soldiers and civilians were much more closely entwined than we realized and than we think about when we think about the Boston Massacre. So when we're trying to figure out what happened that night, how it is that soldiers ended up shooting civilians on the streets of Boston, one thing that we really need to keep in mind is that when Bostonians and soldiers mingled on the streets, they knew each other, often quite well. They didn't always like each other, of course. And so when a lone sentry in the center of town, on what was then called King Street, grew anxious at being hassled by a crowd of Bostonians one night in early March, he called for backup. And the backup that came, so a handful of soldiers led by the captain of the day, all knew at least some of the Bostonians in the street that night. One of the soldiers was named James Hartigan, who was recently married to a Boston-born woman. Another was Edward Montgomery, whose Irish wife Isabella had come to Boston with him 17 months earlier. Now, Isabella did not get along very well with all of her neighbors. Earlier that night, she had shouted loudly enough for people in the surrounding houses to hear the town was too haughty and too proud, and that many of their asses would be laid low before the morning. The Bostonian Sarah Cathcart, clearly tired of both Isabella and her husband, shot back, "I hope your husband will be killed." But not all Bostonians wished death on the Montgomerys. Also on the street that night was a carpenter named Thomas Wilkinson. For a few months, the Montgomerys had rented a home near Wilkinson, and they had become friendly. In the 18th century equivalent of running to a neighbor's house for a cup of sugar, Wilkinson occasionally sent his children to the Montgomerys' home for coals to start his own fire. So when Wilkinson saw Montgomery marching out to support the sentry, he walked straight over to the soldier to ask his former neighbor what was happening. Now, what was happening on that night of March 5th, 1770 is the big question. There are only a few points on which all eyewitnesses agree. When Montgomery, Hartigan, and other soldiers came to give the sentry some support, the captain ordered the Bostonians in the street to disperse. They did not. At some point, someone yelled fire, and the soldiers fired. We don't know who shouted. All we know is that when the smoke cleared, 5 Bostonians lay dead or dying on the ground. And we know that when people looked around, they knew the soldiers and the civilians on the street. At the time, the event was shocking. Everyone was horrified to see Bostonians bleeding out in the snow in front of the seat of governmental power. It'd be like watching people dying in front of the White House. But, and this is a big but, absolutely no one thought that this was the beginning of a revolution. Boston women continued to marry British soldiers. John Adams agreed to take on the defense of the soldiers and the captain. And of course, as you probably all know, 2 juries of Massachusetts men acquitted most of the soldiers. The importance of March 5th, 1770 is not the shooting itself, but rather how that shooting became transformed into the Boston Massacre. Both those people who supported the governor and those who opposed him scrambled to tell their version of the story. Both, of course, wanted to claim innocence, and they wanted to put the blame on the other side. So, they had a number of ways of figuring out how to do that. They did that through pamphlets, as you can see from these 2 very different titles as they try to tell these stories, right? One is a narrative of the horrid massacre, and the other is a fair account of the unhappy disturbance. They tried to show it through images, right? As we see here. And most of all, they wanted to prove innocence through the trial of the soldiers and the captain. But what all of these attempts to cast blame did, in the same way, surprisingly, was to erase women and children and neighbors from the story. We can see it with Revere. We see it in the trials, which deliberately ignored any connections between civilians and soldiers. And both sides found it necessary to ignore the family history of the Boston Massacre. After the shooting, the troops were redeployed. And that really raised a question: what happened to these families when they were ripped apart? They were faced with choices. Women who married into the army could stay in Boston and do what we call now self-divorce, right? They could just stay. Men could stay with their new families and desert from the army, or women could leave with their new husbands, traveling around now the British Empire as shards of Boston embedded into the British Army. This ripping apart of families really is the most significant impact of the Boston Massacre. Let me explain why. Well, it's a very short passage from my epilogue. We inherit the story of the Boston Massacre, and of the American Revolution from a much wider range of people and a far more complicated set of connections than we ever acknowledge. Those who call the American Revolution a civil war portray the conflict as a clash of citizens, a struggle over the definition of a new country. But it would be no less accurate to call the revolution a sibling war. It played out in the upheaval of innumerable families formed and split by the same military occupation. Every family wrestled with that conflict in its own way, and every family was forced to make choices as difficult as they were inevitable. War, peacekeeping, and political administration brought together civilians and soldiers, men and women, children and godparents throughout the British Empire. Those same forces buffeted families and sometimes tore them apart as they moved around the Atlantic Rim. In an 18th century Anglo-American world, in which family and government were closely connected notions, the shooting in Boston marked not the beginning of the American Revolution, but the breakdown of a family. Prior to 1772, the language of family had long saturated British political discourse. But in the context of military families, it took on new and personal meanings. We think of the American Revolution as a political event, but it was much more like a bad divorce. This family history reminds us of the human bonds, as well as the political ones, that were broken at the end of the Boston Massacre and at the beginning of the American Revolution. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Zabin. That was awesome. If you got a question, remember, use the chat feature down at the bottom. You mentioned about the possibilities of the different families once the incident happened. First of all, when news of this went back to England, how was the incident in Boston viewed in England, and how many of those families involved, if you know, what was the percentage of people that stayed in Boston or left or self-divorced? What was the resolution to all of that?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, the way that this read back home, right, in London or elsewhere in England was precisely the problem. That's the PR war that both sides were fighting, right? They really didn't care what people said about it in Massachusetts. They knew, and it wasn't really going to make a difference. What really mattered was what kind of political support they were going to be getting in England. So they put out these competing pamphlets, and hilariously, the pamphlets actually get book reviews, right? They get literary reviews in literary magazines. So you get a whole sense of what people thought of them. And almost everybody says they're completely slanted, one way or the other way. Some people are convinced by one, some by the other. They all understand that they're not getting the whole story here, right? And so the response is really that this is an unsurprising problem. It's a problem, it's unhappy, people wish it didn't happen. But also most people know, and partly because there are lots of civilians who are shot by regiments acting as police in other places in Boston, they understand that this is not an unlikely outcome, right? So the desire to push blame on one side or the other, that's maybe new because it's a little more political than what you might see otherwise, but it's not surprising. As for the families, I would say it's pretty much a mix. I mean, I can't trace all, 2,000 men. I was not able to find all of them, or certainly even when I found many of them, I couldn't necessarily find their wives and what happened to them afterwards. But I would say there are examples of all of those. There are soldiers who end up fighting in the Continental Army later. There are privates and their Boston wives who end up actually kind of making it as much as anybody does and able to buy land in England in the 1780s and 1790s, which is an enormous achievement for a private soldier. So you can see an enormous range. You see more among the officers who also married locals. And, you know, some of those marriages worked. One of them ends in divorce, you know, after the woman left with the soldier. So there's many, you know, every parameter you can imagine, you end up seeing.
In your opinion, was that the necessary outcome? Did they really have to make that regiment leave Boston? I mean, was that really no other way to adjudicate?
Yeah. So, in fact, let's see. So there are 4 regiments in Boston, right, at its peak, and there were two of those regiments actually leave the summer before the shooting. It looks like everything is going to calm down, and looks like maybe this wasn't going to happen at all. Then one of them indeed has to leave pretty much for political reasons, right? The selectmen and the Sons of Liberty demand that they go, right? They say, we never wanted troops here. This is the result of it. And so they get one out, but the 4th regiment, which ends up being the 14th regiment, actually stays. It stays in Boston until 1772. It does move out to the harbor. They do end up in those barracks, but they never really leave. That's, you know, so there's a lot more kind of backroom negotiations than anybody wants to admit to publicly, which is how politics work, right?
You mentioned that you look at the Paul Revere picture and it's, you know, where are the women, where are the children? What was life like? You start the book by talking about the Chambers family. So what was life like for a bride of a soldier, of a child of a soldier? They're coming from England, Wales, Scotland. They're coming to a foreign country. What's life like for them?
When they come, they are not welcomed with open arms, I'd say, for the most part, right? There are a lot of complaints in the newspapers that these women are, you know, they refer to them pretty frankly as whores, as scum of the earth. I mean, really pretty insulting language, right? And there are absolutely incidents where people are yelling at each other or annoyed with each other. There are some sad moments. There's a, not quite an epidemic. I mean, now that we understand what that looks like, but there is an outbreak, a smallpox outbreak in 1769 in Boston that both soldiers and civilians and their families end up getting, right? A lot of people are infected. And when military families and those children and some of the women are infected, they're kind of rowed out to a different island out in the middle of Boston Harbor and, you know, isolated there. It's like a pest house. Boston women with more resources are allowed to stay home, right, and sort of self-quarantine. But these women are pushed out there. And, you know, one of the saddest examples I found is actually another one of Jane's children. So Jane ends up getting smallpox as just one of her children. They're sent out to the pest house. And we have the records of her coming back without her child, and there's just a little scrap of paper receipt that the town selectman paid the town sexton to bury the next day a soldier's child, whom I'm pretty sure is actually one of Jane's kids, who's, you know, sort of dumped somewhere in Boston Harbor, right? Or out on Rainsford Island in an unmarked grave. So there were limits to how generous Boston felt like being. At the same time, when those troops left and women self-divorced, or often women couldn't go with them, even these women from England or Ireland or Wales, wherever, and they end up staying in Boston, the province of Massachusetts does find some welfare for them, puts them in the poorhouse, which, you know, nobody loves, but they keep them from starving at least. They apprentice out their children, which is, again, not a happy outcome, but better than, you know, them starving on the streets. So they try to find the line between treating them as neighbors and, you know, treating them as invaders.
Okay, we got a question here. Hello, this talk was awesome. I know you mentioned that the separation from Great Britain was like a bad divorce. I can envision the interaction of colonists and soldiers in daily living. Great images. When you spoke about public houses, I wondered, what was it like for families, soldiers, etc., as they passed each other in the street, as they walked and rode and entered taverns, as they entered shops to interact with shopkeepers? I wondered, as news reached Boston of escalating tensions, how were people treated on each side? Were some ignored? Did most try to maintain relations socially and hope for the best, etc.? Thank you.
So thank you for the compliments also. You know, really most people do try to create good relationships once they have them, right? Most of the time, you know, so in the beginning, as I said, Bostonians are not happy about it, especially men, right? They're not happy about these women coming in. Young women, who are looking for marriage partners. Boston is majority female at this moment. It's lost actually quite a number of its young men in the 7 Years' War. And there are plenty of young women looking for husbands. So they respond really differently. And I just, you know, part of what I wanted to do in this book was remind us that the Sons of Liberty don't get to tell the same story every time, all the time, right? That these young women have a story to tell too. So they are trying to keep their relationships going. In fact, half of the marriages I found between civilians and soldiers happen after the shooting in March, right? It doesn't end those relationships at all. And really, I think every day felt to them, I write this in the book, is kind of a roll of the dice. Like, you know, was a shove going to escalate into something, right? Because there was, you know, there were plenty of shoves happening. Or were people just going to be like, oh, give it a rest and move on, which happened most of the time, right? So, you know, these guys are drinking together. They're robbing shops together. We see a bunch of that. They're in jail together. They're doing all kinds of things together, right? And most of the time, those relationships work, not beautifully, but pretty well.
How were you able to discover where the soldiers were bivouacked?
So that was a kind of complicated digital mapping project based very largely on warning out records. So as I mentioned, when the town of Boston was afraid it was going to have to support people through welfare, right? They actually hired a guy whose name in the 1760s was Robert Love, to walk around and warn people that if they were not born in Boston, they were not entitled to Boston Poor Relief. That's how poor relief worked. It came from the place you were born, unless you married somebody from that town, and then you became, if you were a woman, you became part of that town's obligations. But soldiers were not of Boston, and they were not. And so the town of Boston was not obligated to support them. And so this particular Warner, he was called, was a really meticulous record keeper. And so every place he went where he warned people, you know, if you need poor relief, don't ask the town of Boston for it. He wrote down where he went, who was living there, whose house they were living in, how many children they had, sometimes the names of their children. And so that turns into an incredible record for where many of these people were living. So that's my kind of biggest piece. And then other parts I looked at people's tavern licenses, right? If people were living in poorhouses, excuse me, in public houses, we have records of who got tavern records, things like that. And then I mapped it all onto that map that you could see there.
Okay, thank you. Here's a question. It ends with, I'm thinking of the collaborators during World War II. Was there an active resistance movement targeting redcoats prior to 1775? And were the landlords who participated in courting the troops subject to persecution or worse during or after the Revolution?
Yeah, and I think that the comparison to World War II is instructive because it actually really does look very different from what happened then, and because they're not seen as collaborators. I mean, really, the Sons of Liberty and the Selectmen are very, very proud of the compromise that they struck with the troops when they first come in 1768, right? Where they are able then, you know, to get the army to pay for housing. The army is notoriously cheap, and honestly, most of the records are about, you know, how little money they have. So the fact that all of these individual Bostonians are then actually able to collect rent from the army feels to them like a great triumph. So there's nothing there that feels like, oh, anybody's sold out, right? Historians have misread that, but in fact, that is how that works. So lots of people who are Sons of Liberty and rented their storehouses or whatever to use as barracks, and they were thrilled about it. So there's no resistance there. And then the piece that I actually found most interesting, because I just didn't really believe it, was, you know, what happened to women who had married soldiers and self-divorced, ended up staying in Boston, right? How were they going to be treated afterwards? And at the time, it does look like things are going to go badly for them. Some guy who signs himself a bachelor writes this really terrible piece of poetry that he publishes in the paper about, you know, how awful it is that Boston women are dating these redcoats. And he says, you know, no Boston man worth of salt would, you know, be seen with what he calls redcoats leavings, right? It's really something. But in the end, many of these women remarry. Their children, the children they had with the soldiers, continue to be known as the children of those soldiers, but they seem to have the lives they would have otherwise. They're apprenticed appropriately, you know, they inherit their stepfather's property, whatever it would be. And these women marry men, some of whom indeed become part of the Continental Army. So the conflicts before 1772, 73, they just don't seem to create that split between loyalists and revolutionaries that we'll see after the Tea Party.
Okay, you may have just answered the next question. Like basically, how were children of these marriages between soldiers and colonists treated? So it's a was there any pushback, or were they were just kids?
I mean, you know, really a lot of it depended on how much help they needed from Boston, right? So some of the commanding officers were more willing to bring these new and growing families with them than others. The army would pay for a certain number of women to travel. Women were considered a formal part of the army. You know, some women, a certain number, and especially to do laundry. Men just wouldn't do laundry. And so they were expected to travel, and their children could come along with them. But there were many, many more women who wanted to be able to travel with their husbands than there were official slots for them. And so then the question was, you know, would the commanding officer allow them to go or not? And some were softer hearted than others. And if women and their children couldn't leave when the troops left, they really were thrown onto people's charity. And then, you know, Massachusetts had a fund for this. Bostonians weren't very happy about using it, I would say.
Well, I want to thank you for doing this tonight. Before you go, I do want to make one mention to this to the audience, because I was looking at the classes that you teach, and we have to figure out a way that we could all do this via Zoom with you for the spring, because Dr. Zabin has a class coming up in the spring called The Age of Hamilton. And so I think there'd be people that they could figure out a way we could audit that class. Let me know how, and I'll get the word out. But thank you very, very much for doing this tonight. Continued success of this book. This was awesome. And thank you for joining us from the great Midwest. I want to thank everyone for joining us tonight. Again, the book is available at 8 Cousins Bookseller. Good luck with this book. Thank you for doing this tonight.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate you all coming out.
All right. Thank you, everyone. Good night.